Mr. Schul, you spent your entire career in development aid in Africa, at the World Bank, at the European Investment Bank, and you're the main author of this brochure, Killer Charities, Together Towards Modern Development Philanthropy, published by IDAY-International. It's a rather shocking title.
Yes, indeed, but it does reflect the effect of charities that maintain misery and lead to these clandestine emigrations that are too often fatal. Moreover, the title reflects the conclusions of a majority of treaties on development aid, some with titles such as Brigitte Erler's Tödliche Hilfe, Dambisa Moyo's Dead Aid, or L'aide contre le développement by Jean-Jacques Gabas.
Is aid to poor countries so devastating?
The fact is that 60 years of foreign aid has not reduced the inequalities between poor and rich countries. To the contrary, underdevelopment is an extraordinarily complex phenomenon involving many economic, social, political, and cultural factors. From the start, it was an illusion to imagine that it could be solved by money alone. Moreover, Walt Whitman Rostow, the creator of foreign aid as a tool for development, makes it perfectly clear in his handbook: an infusion of foreign capital, whether public or private, is not capable of creating economic development. At best, it can accelerate it if it is already in a phase of rapid growth, several times a multiple of population growth. Moreover, Rostow stresses the need to limit foreign aid to only those governments with effective development policies. It is obvious that these conditions are rarely met. So it is not surprising that foreign aid and international charities, as practiced today, do not work. Moreover, one only has to compare China, which has managed to drastically reduce the number of poor people with almost no foreign aid, with Africa, which receives a huge amount of aid, USD 240 billion a year, and where the number of poor people continues to rise, at least until now.
Yet many people feel they're doing something useful by financing schools, hospitals, water supply.
In fact, the overwhelming majority of independent evaluations of foreign aid systematically show the opposite. We have summarized the conclusions of some 20 of them in an appendix to this brochure. The projects you just mentioned may save the privileged few, but they hinder general development and condemn the majority to misery. Fundamentally, the process of development, which consists in strengthening people's capacity to determine their own future, is an endogenous process. One develops oneself, one cannot develop others. By conceiving our aid as an indispensable factor of their development, we achieve exactly the opposite effect to the one sought, because aid accentuates their dependence on a foreign element that they do not control and that remains particularly random.
But many generous donors take into account the demands of local civil society.
Yes, but as the Africans say, the hand that gives money is always above the hand that receives it. In other words, when you bring something that they miss terribly, they will arrange to present you with a project that is most likely to appeal to you. Esther Duflo and her companion Ibiji Banjiri, both 2019 Nobel laureates in economics, have demonstrated in their famous Poor Economics how difficult it is to read the true motivations of the poor. Moreover, as Andrew Mellon, this great philanthropist, is claimed to have said, it is easier to make money than to spend it well, and to strongly recommend that before giving money out, to learn about past experiences with foreign aid before embarking on so-called altruistic actions. What distinguishes philanthropy from charity is that the former trusts in the human capacity to develop, and therefore avoids trying to influence the choice of recipients. The charitable or altruistic donor, on the other hand, seeks first to give himself a clear conscience, which alters his perception of the real needs of those he claims to help. The situation is particularly pronounced for bilateral aid, i.e., the aid from government to government. The International Monetary Fund demonstrated in a 2009 study that a majority of donor governments seek first to satisfy their geopolitical goals before seeking to reduce poverty in the recipient countries. The worst performers are the former colonizing countries, such as Belgium, France, and Great Britain, whose aid is particularly ineffective.
How do you explain that the fact that foreign aid is so harmful for the recipients?
Oh, there are many, many reasons. The best known are the domination of donor interest over the real needs of the recipients, the creation of dependency on foreign aid, the corruption that the flow of very large sums of money inevitably leads to, the illicit transfers to tax havens encouraged by multinationals and the local middle class, the lack of participation of the population concerned in the design and management of investment projects. But there are two more recent reasons which I would like to develop. The first is the Samaritan's dilemma. By financing public investments, schools, hospitals, water, or electricity supply, donors are substituting themselves for local government when it is in fact their responsibility to provide these essential services. Several economists have discovered that by doing so, foreign donors are in fact discouraging local governments to budget more for these essential services. Local governments happen to know that we cannot resist funding these fashionable services: education, health, rehabilitating degraded roads, replacing deteriorated power plants. So why then would they spend their good money on these expenses when we come to cover them with free aid? By funding these services, donors are in fact unwittingly supporting corruption and bad governments and undermining government support for these essential tools of economic growth. There is a second factor. Financing with outside aid the budgets of developing countries allows them to ignore the demands of their people. Our governments in the North are somehow acceding to the economic, social, and political demands of us because they depend on our taxes to carry out their programs. Our foreign aid, instead, private as well as public, frees the local governments from acceding to their people's needs. And because governments do not listen to their citizens, they come begging for alms from rich donors. And the generosity of rich donors means that the local people no longer have to seek their government support. So now the combination of these two phenomena, foreign public aid feeding the state coffers and altruists covering the needs of the people, deprives these countries of the main engine of economic development, which is the synergy between civil society and governments, to which, to be complete, one must add the private sector. This synergy between these three components of any human society is the very essence of what is called participatory democracy, without which no society can develop on an equitable and sustainable basis. Historians show that it is this synergy that is at the heart of the process that allowed our Western civilization to reach our current level of opulence. Foreign aid hinders the emergence of this democracy in a way that is all the more damaging as the share of aid in the gross domestic product of these countries is high. Hence, the conclusion of specialists that the more aid a country receives, the less it develops.
But what can be done then?
First, a warning. I said at the beginning of this presentation that underdevelopment is a highly complex phenomenon. Hence, anyone proposing a miracle solution remains suspicious. Only the combination of various actions can bring about an improvement in the efficiency of foreign aid, assuming that it is really needed. However, any equitable and sustainable solution will necessarily have to include strengthening the capacity of the local civil society to determine its own future. Amartya Sen, winner of the 1998 Nobel Prize in Economics, demonstrated that only economic and social policy developed by government in consultation with representatives of the people concerned are equitable and sustainable. Professor Angus Deaton, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2015, for his work on poverty and its origins, shows that the best foreign aid is that which brings people closer to their rulers. The practical experience of the IDAY-International network shows that representatives of local civil society willingly come together in coalitions in order to have more political clout and conduct a constructive dialogue with their governments, what one calls advocacy. They are in the best position to identify the main obstacles to the fight against poverty, to offer solutions best adapted to the local social cultural context, and to propose solutions at a considerably lower cost than foreign actions. In addition, local civil society ensures that the gains of these actions undertaken remain in place. The saying, giving a fish allows you to survive one day, teaching to fish allows you to feed yourself all your life, is misleading. It is not up to us to teach them anything. They are in a much better position than we are to imagine the solution best suited for their capacities and their real needs. This approach requires donors to prioritize funding, administrative, and structural costs of these coalitions so that they can make their case. Donors must then abandon their preference for so-called concrete or service delivery projects in which they themselves help to solve the problems that, in fact, governments are expected to solve. They must also help these coalitions to participate in regional and international conferences where the fate of the poorest population is usually discussed in the absence of their representatives.
All this is very interesting, but do we still have a role to play? How do these proposals affect us, Europeans?
Let us go back in time. On August 2nd, 1999, at the Brussels International Airport, yes, 20 years ago, the bodies of two young Guineans, Yagin and Fodé, for those who remember, were found dead in the undercarriage of a plane coming from Africa. On them, they carried a moving message, calling on European leaders and its members to create a great organization to help African youth build a dignified life at home. The fact is that we have not sought to really meet their plea. If we want the sacrifice of these two young people and the unintentional sacrifice of thousands of other young Africans not to be in vain, we must intervene with our governments here in the north to demand that they improve the efficiency of their foreign aid. They must in particular stop favoring the interventions in Africa of our own multinationals and our own non-governmental organizations at the expense of the local civil society. Local civil society must be involved in all investment stages: design, implementation, monitoring, independent evaluation. And all investment should be subject to a social and macroeconomic impact assessment made by associations representing the target beneficiaries. But I would like to reiterate once again that improving the efficiency of foreign aid alone is not enough to help Africa's development. African countries need to change their tax regime in order to put, if not an end to, at least reduce sharply illicit transfer to tax havens. The European Union must also reduce its import duties on processed African products because they are holding back Africa's industrialization. It must also, for example, adjust in compensation for fishing rights along the African coast to the real value of the levies, because at the present levels, they leave the populations of these regions with no alternative but to emigrate in order to survive.
What advantage does this new approach have in store for us?
Africa will in the future be able to choose its international partners. Asia, China, India, the USA, Latin America, or perhaps Europe. But Europe, on the other hand, has no choice. Because of its geographical proximity and demographic evolution, its future depends very directly on the development of Africa. From 2050 onwards, there will be more Africans on Earth than Chinese or Indians. Young Africans will account for 1 in 3 active people in the world. The future of humanity will depend largely on their cultural, social, and economic development. Furthermore, everything is changing in the world today, and Europe must change its current foreign aid policy, which is still imbued with a colonial attitude, and change it into a participatory approach, more in line with the requirements of modern times. And let me conclude with a short passage from the memoirs of Prince Otto of Habsburg. I have been a member of the Development Aid Committee of the European Parliament long enough to know that donations only have a positive effect where they are part of a constructive policy. Otherwise, they are a source of corruption and destruction. It is up to our generation to act to ensure that our development cooperation policy finally serves the interest of the people who will determine the future of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren.